Back at the beginning of May, I dropped the season 2 teaser about Medicine Journey, but I also mentioned I wanted to do a couple of quick YouTube episodes on two different topics. One of the topics was how my creative flow has shifted over the last year or two. And I kind of wanted to just share a little bit about that. So, besides doing these podcasts sporadically so far, hopefully more consistently soon. I've also written, so I've written a book and published a novel called Flashpoint: The Final Conspiracy, which is actually just a one-off book about conspiracy culture fiction. But I'm working on another book right now, which is a book about some of my travels in Italy. And having done the first book, I learned a lot about the writing process, uh, and what works for me, finding your voice, how to do revisions, this sort of thing. And I'd imagine anyone in any creative endeavor, you got to cut your teeth. Um, but what I found is that the method I used for the first book was really left brain. And by that, I mean just linear, like, okay, here's the outline, just write it and go through and sort of sequentially, linearly approach it. Um, but going through the coaching training, I've really started to prioritize finding the way that works for you individually. And taking that lesson for myself, I started to just explore and play with what seemed to work. And I also, to an extent, let myself off the hook, meaning there's not a particular right way to do it. What I was doing is I had an idea, an image of what was the way to write a book, and was trying to conform myself to that idea. Right. But this time, what ended up happening is both with the motivation to find the way that worked, with the motivation to not squeeze my heart so much just to produce something, but to want to keep it open to that inspiration, to that spirit, to that right brain creative intuition was sort of the goal. So sometimes what this looks like now, and here's like a couple, maybe a takeaway. What it looks like is literally just sitting and dreaming, sitting and playing, sitting and asking my spirit what is the next thing that wants to happen? What would help? What would help the most right now? And that often looks like dreaming, imagining the plot, getting into a specific area. What's the point? Sometimes we need to inspire, sometimes we need to re-inspire ourselves. And so in writing this book, like what's the thing that's really in my heart right now that wants expression? And it might be chapter 15, a scene at the dinner table, that is just really pulling my heartstrings right now. And so I might go and not even write it, but just like jot down a couple little moments that I wanted to show. And that ended up being the germ of how I approach this. And so what's now happened is that I'm going back between this right brain, intuitive, like let myself enjoy this, be inspired, find the moment that feels like it's coming out, like you're stringing something out, pulling strings out. And there's no right way to do that. It could be at any moment, any moment in the story. So letting myself take the time to play, take the time to re-inspire myself, take the time to do it non-linearly and to play with that, to say, let's see if this works, to really be quiet and just tap into my own creative spirit, my muse, and feel like what's the one next little thing that would help right now to start to pull this out, right? And so what ended up happening for the Italy book so far is that I have lots of scenes with these little threads that have come out that start to cohere and start to assemble. And so, whereas I wrote the first book just linearly, like plow through it, basically, like sit down for 6, 7 hours and just day after day, do that thing. This time I'm trying to let them organically arise. And so sometimes the right thing is also a couple more takeaways. So we got the right brain activated, right? Really get that going while recognizing that you're not going to give up the left brain organizational stuff. So what happened is that these threads started to come out and they started to cohere. And then left brain kicks in. Oh, I see there's some structure starting to emerge. Let me come up with my kind of a master outline. Let me come up with a way of organizing this that is helpful. So, what ended up generating is an outline that was, the chapter title, the main plot points, the character moments in each of those chapters. And then sort of I have a single spreadsheet, maybe 1 page, 2 pages of each chapter with those items, and they started to cohere. And then I did have to take some time to put it into a sequencing, right? So I find there's a tendency, certainly within myself, maybe for the intellectual types, to overemphasize the left brain. Oh, it has to look this way. It has to come out perfect, all this kind of thing. So I'm really working on counterbalancing that by going to the right brain. And if you're stuck, maybe there's a whole different approach vector. It's not about writing this chapter. It might be about outlining it. It might be about re-inspiring yourself. It might be about envisioning a character development. It might be about playing with a voice, playing with your voice, trying to tap into elements of voice that are trying to emerge, that maybe that's really the emphasis rather than doing your 500 words, right? 1,000 words. And that can really get the juices flowing in a way that has been very enjoyable to discover. So I would advise don't neglect the right brain. However, sometimes there's time for left brain stuff. There's times to zoom out or to take a whole different approach with it. Doesn't have to look like meeting your word count. It could be any of these other things that you're playing with. Give yourself the chance to play and to re-inspire. So yeah, the left brain and the right brain can really start to work together, obviously, as they should, but finding the way to do that works for you is the key. Now, that being said, is there a discipline side? Yes, that's a muscle. That's a muscle that I'm not fully back into yet. But what I've also found is that this morning I sat down thinking I gotta do my writing for the week. I've only done one. I need at least a second session this week. And I just did not want to do it. Right. Ugh. Wasn't feeling it. So what did I do? It was like, okay, I don't want to do it. How do I approach this? What's a way to help this? So what I did instead was I found a time chunk that seemed approachable. I was like, okay, sitting down in an hour sounds miserable. Just sitting and writing in front of my screen. Didn't want to do it. I asked myself, can I find 20 minutes? 20 minutes, absolutely. I sat down. I was like, I can do 20 minutes. Then when I let myself off the hook, immediately what happened is that my concept of it and the concept of what outcome I needed was released. And then what ended up happening is that the words came very easily. I worked more than 20 minutes. I got almost 500 words out. And I said, you know what? That's a great session. If I don't do anything else today, it was not an hour, by the way, it was maybe 45 minutes. If I don't do anything else today, that's a satisfactory session, right? So there's also ways of approaching how to set our standards and our metrics in a way that is accessible and available to us. That's not just conforming to this concept of what it should look like. So be willing to pivot. If you don't want to write, maybe there's another thing you can do. Let me iron out this little plot point 2/3 of the way through the book. Something that's easy, but it'll keep you moving. That being said, I am coming back to enjoying my metrics, as you would say, which is, let's say, 2 sessions, 3 sessions a week, 500 words each, right? Maybe for you, it's 2,000 words a week, depending. So some people might set this standard of, I got to write every day, 5 days a week, 500 words a session. So 2,500 words per working week, per writing week. That might work for you. For me, I've found that the daily, conforming to a daily expectation doesn't work for me, but maybe a weekly expectation would be good. So loosen those standards a little bit. Say it's 2 sessions a week or 3 sessions a week. You can have discretion at when you do them, right? Or maybe it's 2,000 words a week. And once you reach that, if it's 2 sessions, if it's 1 session, if it's 4 sessions, that's great. The reason I like this is you give yourself a little more flexibility while understanding that you need to hit these marks or else you're not going to get through it if you have a deadline, let's say a year. If you're needing 100,000 words and that's 2,000 words a week, what is that? 50 weeks, right? So there's your year with 2 weeks off. So if you don't hit those 2,000 words, okay, my getting through this has just been delayed by a week, So you really see the relationship of your goals with the long-term timeline, which works a lot for me. And then you have a very clear sense of what you're trading off if you decide not to do or to hit your marks for the week. So there is benefit of the left brain. So it's getting this left brain and this right brain to work together, but it is loosening the concepts of the left brain and what it should look like while trying to give a bone to your right brain, throw it a bone, to something to chew on that might be way over here compared to what you thought was going to happen. So I think that's the extent of my takeaways. See if I can recap this. 1, use the right brain, give it time, give it space. It is valuable and it needs indulgence and it wants to find its way forward, but find what works for you, right? What you work on today may be different than what you expect, but maybe you got to find the right thing for you. Obviously, pair it up with that left brain. So when it's time to bring structure, that's great. Speaking of being structured, this is the last piece I wanted to remember. I have very much segmented my production pipeline in a way that I did not realize beforehand. So sometimes we need smaller chunks or more specific tasks. What I mean by that, in writing, what I first thought was it needed to come out and it needed to be good, right? Like bang, I reread it. Yeah, that's good. However, over time, I've segmented this and I've reduced the scope of my task to a single pass of a simple task. And then you can go back and single pass a different task. So for example, with this new method of having a kernel of an idea for a given paragraph or a given chapter, and I have a bunch of these, right, all over. And then I start to fill them in and they start to touch like this. So now I have a couple scenes from a chapter that are now ready to connect. So there's a couple things going on here. 1, it was just get these out, grow the seed of each of these scenes. And then when they touch, they probably don't cohere as best as they could. So that's one thing. I threw that out. I was like, don't worry about that. B, I realized the first draft is for you. It's for you, for you, for you. Meaning you are getting onto the page what you want to see in this particular chapter, this particular scene. So that means it doesn't have to be good writing, right? I reread it, I'm like, ooh, like there's some bad parts of this. And I'm wanting to start to revise it, but I've thrown that out, right? Don't worry about that. That doesn't matter. It really doesn't, because there's 2 new passes. I've separated these tasks. What started as basically it needs to be good, it needs to cohere, and it needs to be good writing, hopefully by the very first draft, right? Completely out the window. I mean, sure, you'll get better at it as you start to integrate your processes. It'll naturally come out better the first time. But I've thrown those out. So what happens? This means my next pass, get these scenes stitched together, do your first pass. Then my next pass is going to be make them cohere, link them together in a way that now it flows, right? Third pass maybe, and I don't know if this will be the specific order, but the third pass, now make the writing good. Now make the writing good. So that means now that you have the whole chapter on the page cohering, you can revise your structure, you can add or remove things that aren't needed, and you can adjust your word choices. You can fill in spaces that need a little more pacing work, things like that. What this does is it separates the jobs. You don't have to spend that much of your brain power all at once. And it actually makes it a lot easier. It makes it a lot lighter, lighter, which I really like. And it actually makes it more fun. So I don't know that I can recap all of these. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll rewatch this in editing, and I'll put up a little screen at the end of my little takeaways for the revisions to my creative process. So I guess there'll probably be 4 or 5 items from this. So otherwise, thank you. Thanks for watching. Go ahead and subscribe if you can. I love doing this stuff. Drop a note. Let me know your creative pathway. And if you want to bounce with me for half an hour or an hour to talk about your creative process, I'd love to hear that. Happy to set up a meeting or trade emails or something like that. So I'm passionate about helping people get creatively unblocked and find a way that works for them. So that's it. Thanks for watching.